This is the Marketing for Learning podcast, the only podcast in the world that's guaranteed to help learning and development professionals enhance their skills, capabilities, and knowledge when it comes to marketing for learning. I think we can safely say that marketing for learning is a thing. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Marketing for Learning podcast. I am so excited because I have two wonderful women joining me today for a really special conversation that started on LinkedIn, no less. And we're going to dig into the subject around communications and marketing and whether that could indeed replace the world of L&D. I'm joined today by Dr. Heidi Kirby, who is a learning consultant and has been working in our industry a long time. And I will hand over to you, Heidi, in just a sec to introduce yourself. And I've also got Loren, who is a fractional learning strategist and executive coach. Ladies, thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
Thank you for having us.
I know it's early where you guys are the other side of the pond from me, so I know it's a bit early. So commitment to the cause, I appreciate it. So, Heidi, firstly, would you mind just introducing yourself? Obviously, we've got two guests here. People might be familiar with who you guys are, but just in case they're not, maybe just give a bit of a oversight into your background, and I guess why you're well placed to answer this question that I'm going to ask you today.
Sure, yeah. So I've worked in L&D for quite some time as an instructional designer and then a manager of instructional designers, and now as a freelancer who helps organizations, but also helps new and aspiring instructional designers and L&D professionals as well. So I host an L&D podcast myself, as you know, because Hannah's been on it, called the Block Podcast, and run a website for with professional development resources called Useful Stuff.
Fantastic. Sounds like you're a bit like us in terms of really committed to educating the industry and helping kind of evolve.
Of course.
Give all the knowledge away. That's what I say. I think it helps us evolve as an industry. And Loren, hello. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi. A little bit about me. I've worked on both the HR and L&D side and the business side, so I have a pretty good understanding of why they frustrate each other, which is foundational to a lot of what I do. At the heart of the work that I do is a relentless drive to eradicate toxic leadership and toxic behavior from the workplace. And I spend a lot of my time focused on initiatives that are aimed at fostering culture of inclusivity, belonging, psychological safety. And in 2023, I published a book called Empathy is Not a Weakness and Other Stories from the Edge. And I use a lot of those tactics in my practice of coaching.
Fantastic. I didn't know you had a book and that it was published. So congratulations on that. That's amazing. Oh, always, I have mad respect for anyone who can write a book. It's quite a commitment. So thank you both for joining us. And, as I said, this is a really interesting conversation because it sparked on LinkedIn, and I asked you guys if you would come and talk with me about it, essentially, because you both had quite strong opinions and reactions in terms of what I'd put up. So essentially the nub of the post I put up was I'd been having some conversations with other L&D folks in the industry, and we were really kind of unpicking the notion of the role of L&D within an organization and whether a lot of what we do could just come down to better communications and better educational content within the organization. Need this, go here type stuff rather than, your more robust leadership programs, for example. So the question I bring to you as a starting point, ladies, is can L&D be replaced with good communications in an organization? Who'd like to go first?
I'm happy to.
Yeah, please, Loren.
Short answer is no.
And that's it. The podcast is done.
Right. That's it. The reality is that while communications departments are indispensable in shaping and managing organizational messaging, they cannot be a substitute for learning and development, because learning and development's focus is the expertise and methodology for how people learn. And if you want a skilled and engaged workforce, the the functions are complementary and they can both contribute to the overall success and growth of an organization, but they are drastically different. And replacing L&D with communications would really undermine the critical infrastructure needed to develop people and grow organizations.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree with Loren that the short answer is no. The longer answer is heck no. But expanding on her points too, I think that to believe that L&D can completely be replaced by comms is kind of indicative of one of the big problems that we have in L&D, which is this perspective of we are simply shoving information at people, right? And I think that there's so much more nuance to what we do than that if we do it well. And don't get me wrong, I think there are situations where a training or a course could have been an email, right? Like that is
Sure.
definitely the case in a lot of cases. But to be able to replace the entire learning team, which is marketing or communications, is really a perspective problem, in my opinion.
Heidi, I would just like to expand on that a little bit, just based on what you said. I find myself running into two main pieces of information that I share with the organizations that I work with. One is I call the cupcake analogy, where knowing and learning are completely different. I know that cupcakes aren't good for me, but that's not enough to stop me from eating one every day, even though I know the impact isn't good. And the other piece of that is it's not a one size fits all strategy. And we do not in L&D create 40-hour experts, no matter how much our organizations or the people that we work with want us to. That's just not possible.
Yeah, because I think for me, where my perspective was, but just for context, I do agree with you both in that, it's not a lift and shift like goodbye L&D, see you later. Marketing could have done that job. But where this kind of originates from my perspective is I work with a lot of learning and development functions. And I often see a lack of thinking, particularly around how learning occurs, how learning takes place, the relevancy of learning, the application of learning, allowing employees the opportunity to really embed and apply learning in the workplace. There's this over reliance of the atypical learning tech infrastructure, which is some sort of learning platform, a deluge of content libraries, and an expectation that we put a little ribbon on it and we've done our job. And I think if you look at it that way, if that's what our learning offering is, how much of that could be unpicked and turned into, as you said, could this course have been an email? What could be broken down into more knowledge sharing and education rather than, I guess, learning in its truest sense or pedagogy, right? I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, but that's kind of where it started from for me was actually if this is the way we're going to do it, then we're not really focusing on learning outcomes at all, are we?
Yeah, I think that it's that same kind of like learning needs marketing and comms and marketing need learning, right? Like it's a collaboration, right? And in the organizations where I've worked where it is a collaboration, it works so much better. And those organizations I've happened to work in the customer education side of things, so it's a
Mm.
little bit different. It's not when both departments are contributing to the profits directly, I guess there's a little bit of a different perspective that both are needed. Whereas internally, I've found they're treated very similarly because it is, well, we gave everybody the information, like we gave them 8,000 courses to take. Why aren't they taking the right ones? Or, why aren't they doing the right thing? So I think it's important to remember that it goes both ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of value that communication can bring in communicating the how or the change management of learning programs. What we're running into from the situation that you just explained is the teams that are in the middle of the create it as fast as you can, chuck it over the wall. that doesn't work. And what that does when we continuously do that is minimize the value that L&D can bring to an organization. And something that marketing can help with is helping teams to show the value that they can create on a team by elevating and highlighting the specialized focus on skill development and understanding of exactly what good learning and development that isn't order taking and that is fully cognizant of the organizational needs can bring to an organization. L&D departments are dedicated to continuous improvement of employee skills and competencies. They design and implement training programs that are tailored and address the needs of different roles in organizations. And when other parts of the organization beyond L&D don't understand what L&D can do or the value that it brings, that minimizes the effectiveness of the department. So something marketing can help with is really messaging around that, because L&D departments are historically bad at sharing their value in a meaningful way, right? A value proposition or something like that, or branding.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And to me, it kind of comes down to we don't actually, so there's two things here. We don't look at our learning offering as a product when we're doing almost precisely what you've just described. We still kind of have this tacit assumption that if people think it's important, we don't need to have a value proposition. We don't need to do that good work in terms of building trust and showing people how this is valuable, because they should already know it and they should already see it. But I also think if we rewind a little bit whilst you were talking, I wrote down, what problem are we trying to solve? And sometimes I think that if we were really to look at what areas we could use comms for, like you said, with change management, specific areas of education around, like I said, particulars, go here for this, and building behaviors that aren't necessarily requiring a lengthy blended program or pathway over a period of time. But I don't think we always start with that question. I think you kind of alluded to it, Loren, when you were saying kind of, not order taking, performance consulting. But what's the purpose of this? What are we doing? Could a PDF be enough? Would an email be the most simplest solution to the problem we're trying to solve? Do you think we ask that question enough in terms of why are we doing this? What are we trying to solve? And pushing back on the business, maybe even sometimes.
I love that question. It's a great question in coaching, and it's a great question in L&D that we can ask our stakeholders to really get at the center of what it is that they're trying to do. For example, right now, the pace of technological change is relentless, and people are freaking out a bit about AI, and they're wanting to create programs so that we can either quote unquote replace people with AI or use AI to do our jobs better. But we aren't focused on the problem we're trying to solve. We're focused on how do we use AI. And
Yeah.
so there's an opportunity there, right? If we just pull back, regardless of whether we're in the comms department or we're in the L&D department, what problem is it that we're trying to solve for the organization? How does it tie to the organizational goals or KPIs for a department? And then what value can we bring based on those things?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think we're definitely not asking that enough, because I think if we were really asking that question, we'd realize that, first of all, kind of to what Loren said before, people assume, like we assume when we get a request for training, that the person asking knows what training is or knows what learning is or has some idea, and they probably do, because they probably had an experience as a user or as a learner. But does that mean that they really understand the learning principles? Do they really need a training? We're not asking why enough to get to the heart of it, because to your point, is it really a 2-hour training that HR needs to sit through? or is it an email with a half an hour Q&A session if you have questions, right? And I think we need to be a lot more open, especially when we're talking technological advances and the pace of technology. We need to be a lot more open to other avenues to learning. And again, this is where we can learn from comms and marketing, because they are creating content. They're creating content that is fast and efficient. And we have a lot that we can learn from even just the tools that they're using for content creation while we're over here clunking around in our authoring tool for hours on end, you know?
Absolutely. And I think, so much of what marketing does is educational content anyways. I think about when I launched Mass nigh on 5 years ago now, and I was like, well, bloody hell, no one really talks about marketing all that much. I'm going to have to really spend a huge amount of time educating our industry, not only on the fact that this is even a problem, but most people don't even recognize that it's an issue. And I would say a lot of employees are the same in that they don't always actually understand that there's a problem that they need to solve, and therefore aren't even looking to the solutions that you offer as a learning function to help them with that. But then, how's that educational content communicated? It's a fine line, I think, between an e-learning module and an email, and then, bigger, more complex pathways. Like, these are very different types of learning experiences, right? And I think comms and marketing could potentially replace some of the former, but certainly the latter, and even elements of onboarding, possibly.
Sure.
But I think there's certainly loads where we wouldn't have any validity. But there is an education piece in marketing anyways. You've got to get people to understand your product. Educating them around your product itself is a huge part of marketing. Never mind actually using marcoms as a way to educate rather than using, like you said, courses or authoring tools and such like. It's an interesting lens.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point. Like, we need to really define these things. And I think that's another thing, is that marketing is such a broad thing and learning is such a broad thing. And there's so much nuance there. And these companies just see them both as sharing information a lot of the time, or pushing information. And I think that's where they go, oh, well, like, because I've worked at a company where they tried to replace the learning people with people from marketing and comms, and it
Oh.
didn't work very, very well. From an outsider perspective, they thought it worked just fine. But, I think it's important that we define those, not just in the industry as a whole, but also within our own organizations as well.
I think you bring up a good point, and part of that ties into the question that you asked earlier, what problem are we trying to solve? Because one of the key strengths of L&D in departments that are high functioning is the ability to measure the effectiveness of what we're doing. The metrics, the evaluation techniques, how do we assess the impact of what's actually happening? Is it changing performance? Is it improving productivity? Are people more engaged? But the data-driven approach that L&D should be taking opens up that continuous improvement component, and tied together with marketing and marketing communications, both working well, reaching towards that North Star, whatever we want to call it, is a much better value add overall than just one side doing the thing that is the bright shining beacon in the moment.
Yeah, because I think for me, like, ultimately, even if it's maybe a real oversimplification of what we're discussing, but establishing a process like a triage, like, what are we trying to achieve? Someone comes to you with a request, like, is this needed? I mean, again, this goes back to performance consulting, and actually, is this necessary? Do we need it? And if it is necessary, does it need to go in the format you're asking? Or are you just asking me for this? Always used to surprise me when I worked at vendor side, and people be like, we need a 1 hour module on this. Like, where does this time come from? Like, why have you decided it has to be an hour or half an hour? Like, is that just you're agreeing, Heidi? I've never understood
Yes.
it. I don't understand. So again, is asking those questions and having a process in place to actually say, could this be solved by communications? What are we trying to achieve? What's the best way to reach our audiences? And what do they need to know? And how's the best way to get that information to them to ensure that it's been retained, absorbed? Because again, in some cases, I don't need to necessarily learn something. I just need to know where to go to access that information. Or, like if I need to know how to do something in a spreadsheet, I don't really want to keep that information in my head. So all I really want to remember is either the bookmark of the thing that tells me how to go do that thing. So again, I wonder if there's just maybe, again, what sort of questions should we be asking the business to better diagnose whether, I guess, what, like a learning needs analysis almost, like what do we need to be creating to solve this problem?
We didn't tell you about the big wheel we just spin to tell you how much time it should be and what question we want to ask today.
Please, lift the enigma, because I just sit here like, I don't understand. Like, where's it come from? It's always like just really well-rounded numbers, 45 minutes.
It's so true. Yeah. Like we need a 2 hour, like 2 hour. And I'm like, 2 hour, that's cruel and unusual punishment, but that's really a number I've gotten in the past. Yeah. I mean, I think really, and I know I keep saying this, but I think like the L&D team needs to have a relationship with the marketing team. And there's so many reasons why. And starting to ask your needs analysis questions is just one of those reasons, right? But there's so many different things, like from just the most simple things like branding, right? If you're creating learning materials, most of the time your marketing team has a way that they want them at least loosely branded, where you can kind of take your own your own liberties with it, but they at least want like your company logo and colors. Like that's the very basic relationship that L&D and marketing can have. But if you're asking those right questions of, somebody comes to you and says, we need a 1 hour training because all of our managers suck. Why do you think your managers suck? Where's that coming from? And typically when we ask that, why do you need a training? And we ask it like in a respectful and nice way, that's like, not being like, well, what do you need this for? But when we ask and we start getting to the heart of that, like what's telling you that all of the managers suck, right? That usually becomes a really relevant and powerful data source for us to go and measure after the fact too. But that's where it's going to tell us, well, our employee engagement surveys or our exit interviews or whatever the data point is where we're finding or hearing that the managers are terrible, right? That's going to be what drives, okay, what do we do to fix that? And if it's an in-person training, how do we work with the marketing team to let people know that we are making managers nicer and better,
Yeah.
While we're on that topic, there's another spin to this too that marketing could really help with. In highly regulated organizations, compliance and regulatory training sometimes has a legal requirement of X number of hours that someone has to be quote unquote in training, but we never actually share that information with the end user. And if there were a better way to explain why you have to take 100 hours of arduous compliance training that is done a certain way, it might be helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, because for a long time I had a very long held belief that compliance was like ruining learning functions because it's so different to
It
what else
doesn't
we
have
offer.
to.
No, and I'm like, put it in ops, like something that's essential. Why is it sat with L&D? It's like a different thing. It's risk management. But when I've done a lot of discovery with organizations, and I've worked with like a Fortune 50 insurance company, highly regulated environment, their employees are able confidently to partition the difference between risk management, compliance training, essential. We're covering our ass here. You need to cover yours. This is just what you got to do if you work here. End of story. In contrast to the kind of broader overall learning proposition. So I think that again, it goes back to understanding what it is we're trying to solve, but also how we communicate that to people. I've always said I'd love to do a campaign that's genuinely like, yeah, compliance is crap, but here's why it's important, and actually being real with people and having that candor with them, that authenticity piece is so important. People can smell the crap a mile away these days, I think. And, we don't need to make it all sunshine, rainbows, and peachy kings in order for people to connect with what we're trying to do. I think the honesty and that communication piece, that why, is just so very often missing.
And I think you're pointing out, like, again, the really important connection, right? Like the authenticity and the messaging that comes with having good comms and having good messaging around that compliance training. But if your compliance training itself, if the actual content is dated and you're still talking about floppy disks and flash drives in 2024 when we have the cloud, right? And how to, when 90% of your workforce is remote, but you're telling people how to safely transfer flash drives out of the office building, that's where people are like, okay, you said all these really nice things and you said that it was going to suck, but it has absolutely no bearing on what I do day to day. So that's like where the learning piece comes in, and where we have a responsibility on learning teams to say, this content is relevant and fit for purpose. And even though it's compliance and even though it's boring, it still is actually relevant to your job. And I think that's the other important part.
And I think that marketing is better at discerning what I call the WIMI, what is most important here. And L&D isn't always great at asking that question of the business.
It's a great point.
Okay, these are all the things that you want to cover, but really, what's most important here? What do people need in what's the difference between what we have right now and where we need to be, and where is that gap in what we have and what we need, and what do people actually need to know, not how much information do they need to have.
I don't think we ask that hardly enough of ourselves or our audiences either, really,
And I have seen multiple organizations with ideas about how much information needs to be consumed. And we're talking like novels worth of information that people are reading during a training class, and there's no application whatsoever. Or we need to consider the environment that people are working in. Here we have them in a nice little sterile environment where everything happens textbook way, exactly the way it's supposed to happen. Then we put them in the real world, and that's not really how things go. So how can we get closer and create communication around the differences? There's really a great opportunity for partnership in communicating not just the value, but the how we do it and how we sell it back to the business.
Definitely. Because I think for me, and again, going back to the original LinkedIn post that started this whole discussion, I think I said something along the lines of, learning is the product ultimately. And if we're not focusing on that first and foremost and making sure that that's fit for purpose, that it's helping to achieve business goals, but it's actually also meeting the needs of employees. Relevancy, context, as Heidi said, that comes up repeatedly in the discovery sessions and market research we do for clients, because most learners just don't understand what's available to them, but also how it pertains to their current role, helps them maybe accomplish their career aspirations, whether that's climbing the ladder vertically or horizontally somewhere. And so what we end up having is this really muddy learning offering that is highly complex, or oh gosh, I want to develop a new skill in, I don't know, listening. And I'm going to go on my LMS and I'm going to search for that. And then 15 courses, more would, by the way, come up. Which one's the best? Which one should I do? Where's my skill level at? How do I know? Oh, look, all the time I had for learning is now gone. So I think again, when we consider, I think we're all in agreement, comms in and of itself cannot replace L&D, nor can marketing. It's more about the role that, like, I guess the dance that these two have together. And for me, marketing you can't put the horse before the cart. So if we haven't done that work in terms of, the WIMI, I've never heard that before. I do what's in it for me, but I love that. We talk about minimum viable product and things like that all the time. Like what are just the essentials here? But I think we need to also really consider how robust our product is before we think about marketing it, right?
Yeah, I've used the term product market fit in L&D before because it's
Yeah,
just something I'm
same.
familiar with. And it's interesting. And it's interesting when you look at specifically like ed tech products. I don't know why this comes up for ed tech products, but you think of a company where they want to sell to learning professionals. So they want to know enough about learning, but then they also have like their marketing arm. And I'm thinking of a very specific LMS whose chief learning officer of this ed tech company, this LMS company, is out there talking about performance and talking about the WIMI and talking about how to make learning really relevant. Meanwhile, I get ads on my LinkedIn from the same LMS's marketing team talking about AI can put your content out for you. Just throw in a paragraph and it'll spit out a quiz. And, like just very like, it's not product market fit. And I'm like, I would never purchase this product because look at the huge disconnect between your chief learning officer and your marketing team, right?
Yep. Yep. I think I know who you're talking about. And I totally agree. I think that this is, funnily enough, I did a podcast recording earlier with Hannah, and we were talking about how siloed L&D teams can even get in amongst themselves, and ensuring that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. For me, that draws back again to that piece around understanding what it is we're trying to achieve, and then how we best go about achieving that. So what's the business strategy? Then how does that cascade into our learning strategy? Once we've got our learning strategy and our product up to scratch, then what's the marketing look like, and who's best placed to do that? What does comms look like? Could we use comms for certain elements of what it is that we're trying to achieve? But in that order.
You've got me over here ruminating on a couple of things. One is how we
Which vendor
describe.
is it?
No, not that. I know that very well. But when we look at our LMS and how we describe what's in it and what the courses are, boy, how could marketing help with some of those descriptions? The second piece of this, and this has always kind of stunned me about L&D, and I feel it's very antiquated. We always write the objectives for our courses, and that's great because we want our measurement and our objectives to match. But do our end users really need to know what our objectives are?
No.
They don't care. It's important. It's an important part of creating the design and making sure that we're doing what we need to do so that we can measure what we need to measure and making sure those things match. But your end user doesn't really want to know that. Isn't there something more fun we can do to tell you what you're going to get out of this course? That's another area that I think marketing could really, really help in.
Yeah, I mean it's the equivalent of me as a marketer basically doing posts on LinkedIn or paid ads that say, my boss wants you to buy this, so I think you should. It's like
Exactly.
you need to translate the reason you created the learning into a reason for them. So that to me is like taking a feature and translating it into a benefit, or understanding your audience well enough to understand why that course exists for them in the first place, and focusing on the with them, right? The what's in it for me, what they're going to get out of that time investment, that transaction.
It's funny. I'm speaking at a conference next week and what on program management and L&D. And one of the things I'm saying is your mission, if you choose to accept it, is understanding your stakeholder and what their needs are and connecting with
Yeah.
those. We get so internally focused sometimes about the right way to do things by the textbook of L&D that sometimes we forget who we're supporting or what the impact is on the business. And if we can't sell that impact or know what that impact is so we can deliver it, we might as well not be there in the first place.
Yeah, and I think we sometimes when we refer to the business, we consider them a separate entity. It's like, no,
Right.
we're part of the business. We either work for a client or work for a company, and we have an obligation to help them meet their goals first, right? And I think you're exactly right. I think one of the biggest pieces missing in our evaluation is considering our stakeholders, but also our subject matter experts too, right? Like those people both come into learning projects with expectations. And I love that we've started to consider our end user or our learner more, but we also need to consider other people as well.
Well, people always talk about L&D needs a seat at the table. L&D is the table. All of the chairs are
Yeah.
connected to us.
Yeah.
Yes, that's so
Bring them to
true.
your table, right?
Yeah.
And I think as well, like for, I think we are chronically bereft of a concerted effort around market research and like actually genuinely understanding our organizational landscape and the people that exist within it. I see oversimplification of complex problems like, oh, well, we'll just use job titles to segment our audiences when I can see both grimacing, thank you, thank you. This makes me happy. Because it's completely ineffective. Again, I can see how it works from a learning diagnosis perspective. Someone does X role. This helps us understand what skill sets they might require, what skill sets they need to do their current role, but again, what steps they might need to take if they want to advance their career. This is great for us in terms of learning and developing training that's appropriate and relevant and contextual for people. It means nothing when you're trying to do marketing to these people because it doesn't tell us anything about them. We have no lens or view of who these people are, how that sits within the organization. And so this kind of, I guess this sometimes we make too much of a jump and unify marketing and learning too much and think, well, it's the same thing. And actually these just are two very different needs analyses, and therefore we need to approach them really differently.
Collaboration, imagine what it could do if we collaborated well, especially in analysis. I am someone who would rather spend the front end unraveling all of the things, for lack of
Yeah.
a better way to describe it, because I don't like rework.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
If you haven't got those foundations in place, where do you go from? Everything's wrong from there.
You build the house with a garage on the
Yeah.
roof.
Exactly.
Why?
Exactly. Because that's where you find out what the best solution is instead of just trying to come up with solutions and throw them at the wall and see what sticks, right? If you're asking the right questions from the very beginning, you're getting to, okay, what's the best way to solve this problem? And then what's the best way to communicate to you that we're going to solve this problem?
Hmm,
Because we're not good at tapping into the emotions, and marketing is better at that. So I think
for
it's
sure.
taking the head and the heart together to deliver on the result that the business needs.
And that is the crux of it for me, is we are still here to serve the business ultimately,
Right.
right? That should never change. And I think, again, I see this as a mental blocker when we do the master class and, when I'm working closely with clients on big strategic projects. You're here to serve the business, but using business needs and business requirements, learning objectives and such like as a way to sell learning is again completely ineffective because you've missed that piece in terms of how we realign business need into learner need. We know why we've created the learning. We know why the L&D department exists. Great, cool. That gives us purpose. But how do we translate that into something that's purposeful for the employee as well? That's been that shift of messaging, that change in mindset, that re-looking through the lens, as it were, is really significant, I think. So, how do we start to collaborate then, right? We've talked a lot about how important collaboration between marketing and L&D can be. Again, from my perspective, internal comms also are quite an important function for L&D. And these days as well, sometimes that's even people, which tends to also embody talent. These people are highly useful because they do have a good understanding of the employee base, what works even from a channels perspective. But I'm just curious to ask you guys, if you've seen ways of how L&D is collaborating with other critical functions across the organization, or lessons learned maybe in ways or failures that you've had in ways that you've tried to kind of create stronger bonds or foster stronger cohesion across functions, and how that's worked.
I think one thing that's really important is the culture of the organization and the importance for L&D to just meet people that don't work in our own department and
Mm.
talk to them first about non-critical projects. Like just talk to them about what they do, talk to them about their role, and like have those meetings with people when you first start a new role in an organization. Or if, I came in as the first manager of instructional designers at an organization. And so I spent time just half an hour with different people talking to them about what they do for that specific company, because a marketing manager at this company is going to be different than a marketing manager at this company than at this, just like our roles are different depending on which company we work at, right? So just figuring out what is it that you do, and then just having a conversation of how can we work together? How can we help each other? And you'll find a couple of things that I've found. You'll find data, like so much data. You'll be like, oh, wow, I can come here for, here's where IT keeps all the help desk tickets, or here's where all the employee engagement surveys are. You'll find so much data, but then you'll also find that there are people doing things similar to you or even the same as you, right? There's other people creating learning somewhere in your organization that probably shouldn't be, where you can say, oh, hey, maybe we should work together on this. So you're providing yourself job security. You're also going to make that learning experience better. And you're going to be able to work with that person and then go to them the next time you need help with something as well.
Mm. Yeah, building
I'll
relationships out of a specific need, I think is much better. So you're not just going transactionally saying, "Hey, could you send this email for us?" Or, there's
Right.
an established. Sorry, Lauren, I know you wanted to add something there, but I just wanted to kind of close off that train of thought.
No, I'm very aligned with Heidi here. I think that there is value in the qualitative data that we often don't get or don't look for. And we have to make sure that we have a good balance of both. And I've seen
Mm,
organizations where people do just what Heidi was saying, but I've also seen organizations where L&D has a communications arm attached to it
yep.
that is then dotted line attached to the corporate comms component. And so while the smaller scale projects can be handled in-house with a communication person who has that foundation and skill, the larger items are tied more to the corporate comms team and they're brought in as a work stream within that project. I think we have to do more of that. And I think we have to consider it's kind of in the same, you shouldn't measure ROI for every single project in perpetuity for all of L&D, but there are some projects that you should make sure that you have ROI for. I think there are some projects where the broader, larger communication organization would be really effective and helpful, and others where L&D can have their own comms person with that expertise that can help with some of the smaller scale projects.
Yeah, because in my experience, they're a highly useful resource for L&D when effectively leveraged. But you've got to play nicely with them, and that's the key for me is like establishing brand hierarchies. It's very clear internal comms, the master brand, that will always be more important than the L&D brand. That's how the organization sees it, and that is our place in the world, as it were.
And there's a fine line between confidence and arrogance. We can be really confident about what we do, but when we get arrogant about it, we're in trouble.
Hmm. And they hold the keys to so much of the communication channels that exist within the organization as well. I mean, like one of my clients at the moment, they literally can't send en masse email at all because it is literally held by internal comms and
Yes.
they have it on lockdown. And so even things like you said, Heidi, being able to create visual assets that aren't going to get you in trouble needs some input from the brand police, and again, having those relationships early doors means that there might be templates that you're not aware of, or there might even be some resource on their team to help you create something that you can be really confident is on brand, but has also been created by a marketer, i.e. is using slightly different messaging, slightly different language. I think we can all create a picture that has some words on it, especially with the accessibility of things like Canva these days. But is it a marketing message, or is it sorry, excuse me, is it a marketing message or is it a learning message? And these folks who eat, sleep, and breathe this world and have a much closer touch point with your employee base than sometimes L&D does, I think can be a massive font of knowledge and resource for us.
I think you also bring up a great point about efficiency, right? And I think that's also where our perspective in L&D needs to shift is companies do not want to hear how many hours all the employees spent training anymore. They do not want that number, a massive number of like 8,000 hours our employees were trained this year. They want it to be more efficient. They want less time spent training. They want you to be doing your actual day job more because companies are running leaner and the economy has kind of just made it thus. And if we're able to work with marketing successfully, if we're able to, use tools that marketing's already used to create content so we don't have to go through the whole IT procurement process. If we share data with marketing, if we use the brand materials that they provide, we can do our jobs faster and make the business happier.
Well, add on top of that, if we measure it well, even though we're not considered a money generating component of the organization, we can prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that we do generate dollars.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then that leads to a likelihood of getting more budget, getting more head count.
Right.
Again, getting that seat at the table in inverted commas. Like if ultimately what we've all talked about today, if we're not able to communicate our value to the business, how are we ever perceived as valuable?
Exactly.
So like, do we want them to continue to invest in us? Or again, turn into what I am seeing more and more, which is this kind of homogenization of HR people, HR talent, L&D into this kind of people function. And, pros and cons of both. But I think if you're able to really, truly evidence the impact of your learning function, you're not going to go anywhere. Again, you talked about job security earlier. That's, if we want to kind of future-proof ourselves and not get knocked out with the next COVID, whatever that might be. Well, ladies, believe it or not, we've been chatting for nearly 45 minutes or so. Time flies. This is it. We could spend an hour, 2 hours talking about this subject. Usually I ask if there's kind of one parting thought that you guys would like to add, or maybe one key takeaway or something that you really want our listeners to put in their pockets from this conversation, something that's really, what got your being up on it in the first place? What do we need to look out for? Or what's your biggest tip in terms of embracing communications whilst not looking for it to be outwardly replacing our learning function?
I think for me, it's I know this is kind of a message that you've shared a lot throughout the podcast, but just because you build it doesn't mean that they'll come, right? Like that is that's the biggest thing. And that the relationship really does need to be collaborative and not because a lot of times we can bump heads and get territorial with marketing and comms too. We didn't really talk much about that, but I've seen that happen at a lot of organizations where it's like, well, you're limiting us to certain brand colors and you're limiting us to only being able to go through you to share emails. But when that relationship is collaborative, it can be really, really powerful.
What's standing out for me is be a window, not a wall. Be a partner.
Love that. I absolutely love that. Be a window, not a wall. Because I think that is, the reality is we're not in charge of things like brand, and there is a way for us to work together. And the sooner we I always say to my clients, as soon as I know the shape and size of the box that I've got to stick in, then I know where I can push the boundaries, where I can stretch out a bit and know where I can play around. But we need to know our role hierarchically within the organization, but we also need to know how these functions serve each other. But I love that. Be a window, not a wall.
Yeah, air flows in and out of a window.
Yeah, you can see through it too. It's a bit more transparent.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I mean, I could go crazy with that analogy. I'm a marketer.
Go
I
ahead,
can
have at
spew all
it.
day long.
You're the marketing person. Do it. You can have it. It's yours now.
I love that. No, I think that's a wonderful parting thought about being open, being a little bit more candid, and like I said, having that candor with other functions as well in terms of, what is it we're really trying to achieve here. Something I spoke about with Josh Novell, one of our previous guests, was all around people experience and pulling in the right people to help solve a problem, and unless we really know who in the organization can help us solve those problems, we can't do that, which means we're then very much stuck in our L&D silo. So I love that, being open and being willing to, you said it as well, Heidi, being open to different things and trying different things and not just looking at the straightforward solutions to these really complex problems that we're enduring in L&D. So our hour is nearly up. I'm sure you guys have a lovely day ahead. Mine's nearly finishing here, but you're on the other side of the Atlantic, aren't you? So your day's just started. But honestly, thank you so, so much. I know you ladies are busy, so for giving me your time, Loren Sanders and Dr. Heidi Kirby, well deserved and earned, and we won't be missing that off. Thank you so much for your time and for coming on the Marketing for Learning podcast and sharing your insights, thoughts, and ideas. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Enjoy the rest of your day. See you later.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.